Picture this: a winter's night in the year 1457. Wind howls across the frozen coast of Wales, rattling the towers of Pembroke Castle. Within its cold stone walls, the cries of a child echo through the corridors. They are not the cries of an infant, but of a girl barely 13 years old, writhing in agony on a blood-stained bed. Lady Margaret Beaufort, noble by birth and fragile in body, fights for her life as midwives whisper desperate prayers in Latin. Flickering candles throw wild shadows across the chamber, illuminating a scene at once sacred and brutal. Every contraction tears through her like a blade. The baby is too large, her hips too narrow. The physician shakes his head, his face grim. They all know that nature has been forced into a cruel gamble. For Margaret's body is not yet a woman's, she is still growing, still a child. And yet within her womb lies England's fragile future, a boy who, if he lives, will one day wear a crown and bring an end to the bloodiest dynastic conflict in English history. Outside, the world is silent beneath snow. Inside, destiny is being written in blood and pain. It is in this crucible that Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, will be born. But to understand how such a tragedy could fall upon a girl so young, we must step back and trace the path that led her to this chamber. Margaret Beaufort was born in May of 1443, the only child of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. Her bloodline was illustrious, descending directly from John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. This heritage made her a valuable pawn in a realm where blood determined destiny, and where noble children were less individuals than pieces on a political chessboard. Yet royal blood was no guarantee of safety. It was both blessing and curse, a lure for ambition and a mark for destruction. Margaret's father, John Beaufort, carried both pride and despair. He had once commanded English forces in France during the waning years of the 100 Years' War, but defeat followed defeat, and his reputation collapsed. Some said shame drove him to take his own life. Others whispered of poison, for whispers of poison clung to every untimely death in those days. Whatever the truth, he was found dead in his chambers in May of 1444, leaving his infant daughter fatherless and vulnerable. The shadow of his disgrace would haunt Margaret's childhood. Her mother, left to secure her daughter's future, wasted no time. In the world of 15th-century England, girls of noble birth were married almost before they could read or write. At 6 years old, Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. The match promised to bind two powerful families together, but politics turned quickly. Suffolk was accused of treason and brutally murdered at sea, struck down with a rusty sword as he attempted to cross the Channel. The betrothal vanished with his blood, and young Margaret's life was redirected once more. What followed would set the course of history. At the tender age of 12, Margaret was married to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was a man in his 20s, hardened by politics and war, and half-brother to King Henry VI, through their mother, Catherine of Valois. Edmund represented the rising Tudor family, Welsh outsiders whose claim to power rested less on ancient bloodlines than on royal favour. The marriage was a triumph of politics. For Margaret, it was the end of childhood. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, where Margaret had once played in the gardens as a little girl. Tapestries of her Beaufort ancestors hung on the walls, silent witnesses to the ceremony that sealed her fate. Edmund spoke vows with confidence. Margaret, still in girlish clothes, repeated words she barely understood. That night, the marriage was consummated, as custom demanded. For Edmund, it was duty. For Margaret, it was trauma, an experience so scarring that she never spoke of it later in life. Within months, Margaret was pregnant. Her belly swelled, her body strained under a burden it was never meant to carry. Her mother looked on with dread, remembering her own childbirth at 18, and knowing her daughter's risk at 12 was infinitely greater. But Edmund Tudor would not live to see his child born. In the autumn of 1456, he was captured by Yorkist forces in Wales and imprisoned in Carmarthen Castle. The circumstances of his death remain shrouded in suspicion. Officially, he succumbed to plague, but whispers suggested betrayal, even murder. Whatever the cause, he died swiftly, leaving Margaret a widow before her 13th birthday, pregnant and utterly alone. It was Edmund's brother, Jasper Tudor, who took responsibility for the girl and her unborn child. He brought her to his fortress at Pembroke Castle, perched high above the sea. The journey itself was punishing. Winter roads were deep in mud, swollen rivers blocked the way, and every mile carried the threat of armed bands. Margaret travelled in a litter, jolted painfully with every rut in the road. Each jolt reminded her of the life inside her, fragile as a candle flame. Pembroke Castle loomed like a stone giant above the storm-tossed waters of Milford Haven. Its great keep rose 80 feet into the air, a circle of ancient stone that had withstood centuries of siege. But though it was strong, it was not kind. The rooms were cold, the air sharp with sea salt and smoke, the wind moaning through every crack. It was a fortress of survival, not comfort. And it was here, in the heart of winter, that Margaret's time came. As the first pain seized her, the women around her exchanged grim glances. They had seen this before, a child asked to give birth to a child. The physician, Dr. Lewis of Caerleon, muttered of narrow hips, bad positioning, and dangerous odds. The midwives prepared herbs, knives, and relics, balancing between medicine and prayer. Outside, Jasper Tudor paced in silence, knowing that within those walls, his family's future, and perhaps England's, teetered on the edge of life and death. By dawn, Margaret lay half-conscious, her screams fading into hoarse gasps. Blood stained the sheets, sweat poured from her brow, and every soul present feared the worst. Yet against all odds, she clung to life. And as the cries of a newborn pierced the air, destiny announced itself. The child was Henry Tudor. Born of suffering, cradled in uncertainty, he would grow to wear the crown of England. But for Margaret, 13 years old and broken by the ordeal, the cost was beyond measure. Her body was scarred permanently, her innocence gone forever. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The birth of Henry Tudor was both miracle and curse. As dawn broke over the sea, the newborn's first cries rang out, but his mother's life hung by the thinnest of threads. Margaret Beaufort had endured an ordeal that no grown woman could easily survive, let alone a girl of 13. Her body was torn, weakened beyond repair. The physician, Dr. Lewis of Caerleon, whispered grimly that she would never bear another child. In that single night, Margaret's future as a mother had been sealed, her fertility sacrificed to bring forth the boy who would one day change the destiny of England. Her recovery was slow, agonizing, and uncertain. Fever racked her body, infection lingered, and the midwives hovered constantly, spooning broth between her lips and reciting prayers to ward off death. At times, she seemed to drift between worlds, half in the realm of the living, half in the realm of the dead. Yet Margaret's spirit did not break. The suffering carved into her something harder, sharper. It was as if the girl who had entered Pembroke Castle in fear and innocence was burned away in the crucible of childbirth, leaving behind a woman of iron resolve. Psychologically, however, the scars were deep. Nightmares haunted her sleep, bringing back the screams and the tearing pain. She developed a fear of physical intimacy, flinching at even the gentlest touch. Holding her infant son filled her with both joy and dread. Joy that he lived, dread at the memory of how he had been brought into the world. Her devotion to religion intensified, becoming less a comfort than an obsession. She spent long hours kneeling in prayer, sometimes until her knees bled, beseeching God for strength. It was in faith that she sought meaning for her suffering, convincing herself that her ordeal had been part of divine design. For Margaret, motherhood was both blessing and loss. She adored Henry, yet she would see him only rarely. When he was but an infant, his guardianship was entrusted to Jasper Tudor, Edmund's brother, who raised him in Wales. For Margaret, separated from the child for much of his youth, motherhood became a relationship of longing, preserved through letters, prayers, and gifts sent across dangerous distances. Still, life demanded that she move forward. In 1458, still weak from childbirth, Margaret was married again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. It was not a love match but a political alliance, calculated, practical, and above all, safe. Stafford was a Yorkist sympathizer, and his name offered Margaret protection in an England sliding deeper into chaos. The Wars of the Roses had already begun. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster clashed in bitter rivalry for the crown. The first battle had been fought at St. Albans in 1455, and by the time Margaret married Stafford, the kingdom was a tinderbox of rebellion, betrayal, and shifting loyalties. To survive, one needed to adapt, and Margaret learned quickly. Her marriage to Stafford lasted 14 years, a long stretch by the brutal standards of the age. Theirs was more partnership than passion, but it gave Margaret space to grow in experience and intellect. She managed estates, studied law and scripture, and built a household known for discipline and learning. She began to observe politics with a sharp, calculating eye, studying the moves of greater players: Margaret of Anjou, the fierce Lancastrian queen; Elizabeth Woodville, the beautiful Yorkist queen whose secret marriage to Edward IV had scandalized the realm. Margaret understood that women, often underestimated, wielded influence in subtler but no less powerful ways. Through correspondence, patronage, and whispered alliances, they shaped the currents of war as surely as any sword. And Margaret, with her intelligence, piety, and resilience, was preparing herself to be counted among them. Meanwhile, her son Henry was growing up far from her embrace. Raised under Jasper Tudor's guardianship in the wild landscapes of Wales, the boy learned skills of survival that would one day serve him well. He studied horsemanship, music, and the art of diplomacy, but also learned the harder lessons of exile: how to win loyalty without power, how to endure uncertainty, how to keep faith in the face of danger. Margaret followed his growth through carefully coded letters and tokens sent across the miles. Each letter, each gift, was a lifeline between mother and son, yet her heart ached with every passing year, knowing she was a stranger to the boy she had nearly died to bring into the world. The Wars of the Roses grew bloodier. Edward IV rose to power, deposing the weak Henry VI, only to lose the throne and regain it again in a cycle of betrayal and bloodshed. Margaret and Stafford, ever cautious, survived by aligning themselves with whichever side seemed most secure, yet never forgetting her Lancastrian blood. She became skilled at diplomacy, speaking in careful phrases, never revealing more than she intended. Her survival depended on it. In 1469, Stafford was gravely wounded at the Battle of Edgecote. The injury left him weakened, embittered, and less loyal to Edward IV, whose rewards he felt did not match his service. Margaret nursed him through his long convalescence, but in the process she learned another lesson: how to influence, how to sow doubt, how to shift a man's loyalties not with confrontation but with patience and subtle persuasion. It was a skill she would wield again and again in the years to come. By the early 1470s, Margaret had shed the last traces of childhood. She was no longer simply the girl who had been a child bride, nor merely the mother of a boy in exile. She was something far more dangerous, a strategist. In the candlelit silence of her chambers, she pored over books, corresponded with nobles, and began to weave the first threads of the web that would one day place her son on England's throne. Yet, even as she planned, the wars raged on. She lived with constant fear that Henry would be captured, fear that Jasper would fall in battle, fear that one wrong word might bring Yorkist soldiers to her door. But fear did not break her. It sharpened her. Margaret Beaufort, the child who had nearly died in childbirth, was now being forged by blood and fire into one of the most formidable women of her age. The Wars of the Roses had not yet reached their climax, but when they did, Margaret would be ready. By 1471, the Wars of the Roses had reached a brutal turning point. The Lancastrian cause was collapsing, crushed by Yorkist victories. Henry Stafford, Margaret's second husband, died soon after, worn down by wounds, illness, and disappointment. His death left Margaret a widow once more, but this time older, wiser, and far more dangerous than the girl who had been married to Edmund Tudor. For Margaret, widowhood did not mean retreat, it meant opportunity. She was now free to choose alliances that served her ambitions. And her ambition, by now, had crystallized into a single, unshakable purpose: to see her son Henry on the throne of England. Her path forward lay with Thomas Stanley, one of the most powerful nobles in England. Stanley was a man famed for his ability to survive. A master of duplicity, he had perfected the art of waiting until the last possible moment before choosing sides, always managing to back the winner. His family commanded armies in the northwest, and his influence extended from the royal court to the merchant guilds. For Margaret, marriage to Stanley was a calculated move, one that would give her cover, protection, and access to networks of power. Their union was pragmatic, not romantic, but it was effective. Margaret brought to the marriage her Beaufort blood and her relentless determination. Stanley provided his vast resources and political instincts. Together, they formed a partnership that would reshape England. Meanwhile, Henry Tudor had been driven into exile. At 14 years old, with the Lancastrian line extinguished after the Battle of Tewkesbury, he became the sole surviving male heir of his house. It was both a blessing and a death sentence. Staying in England would mean capture and execution. And so, with Jasper Tudor, Henry fled across the sea to Brittany. Exile was no escape from danger. In the shifting politics of France, Brittany, and England, Henry was a pawn to be bargained, betrayed, or sheltered, depending on the winds of diplomacy. He lived under constant threat, sometimes honored as a guest, sometimes watched as a prisoner. Yet from across the Channel, his mother's presence still reached him. Margaret sent coded letters, hidden messages written in invisible ink, prayers, and gifts, disguised as innocent tokens. She built an intelligence network that rivaled that of kings, gathering whispers from courts, monasteries, and merchant ports. Few women of her time or any time showed such skill in espionage. In April 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son, Edward V, to inherit the throne. But the boy would never be crowned. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a ruthless coup. Edward V and his younger brother were taken to the Tower of London, never to be seen again. Whispers spread that Richard had murdered them. The disappearance of the princes destroyed Yorkist legitimacy. In that moment, Margaret Beaufort saw her chance. Richard's reputation was blackened by suspicion, and her exiled son's claim, though distant and weakened by questions of legitimacy, suddenly appeared plausible. England needed an alternative. Margaret was determined that alternative would be Henry. She began to plot with audacity that shocked even her contemporaries. Working with Bishop John Morton and other conspirators, she coordinated a rebellion against Richard while arranging for Henry to land in England. Letters crossed the Channel, funds were raised, secret oaths sworn. It was an enterprise of breathtaking risk. The rebellion failed in October 1483. The rising was crushed, conspirators executed, and Margaret herself placed under house arrest. Her titles and estates were stripped, her life preserved only because of her marriage to Stanley. Yet confinement did not silence her. Even under watch, she continued to weave her web, using servants as messengers, encoding letters in prayer books, and whispering promises to allies who dared to listen. For 2 years she maneuvered in shadows, waiting for her moment. That moment came in August 1485. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven with a small army of French mercenaries. He marched inland, his banners fluttering with the red dragon of Cadwallader, the ancient symbol of Welsh kingship. Across the countryside, supporters trickled to his side. The decisive confrontation came at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August. Richard III arrived with a far larger force. The outcome seemed inevitable, but Margaret had played her final card. The Stanleys, her husband's family, held back their troops, watching the battle unfold. At the critical moment, they turned not for Richard, but for Henry. It was the betrayal that decided the day. Richard, refusing to flee, charged directly at Henry but was cut down in the mud. His crown was seized and placed on Henry's head. Against all odds, the son Margaret had borne in agony at 13 was now King Henry VII of England. The Wars of the Roses ended in that moment, sealed not only by battlefield victory, but by the marriage Henry soon made to Elizabeth of York, uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York into the Tudor Rose. Margaret Beaufort, the girl once broken by childbirth, became the most powerful woman in England. The king's mother, the founder of a dynasty. Yet even in triumph, she never forgot the cost. She had sacrificed her body, her childhood, and her happiness for this victory. She lived out her days in influence, a matriarch who guided policy, education, and religion, her hand always steady on the reins of power. She died in 1509, just days after the coronation of her grandson, Henry VIII. Her tomb in Westminster Abbey proclaims her piety and virtue, but it cannot capture the full measure of her life. The girl's scream in a cold chamber, the widow's prayers whispered in exile, the mother's ambition burning across decades of war. Margaret Beaufort transformed suffering into strategy, pain into power. Through her, the Tudor dynasty was born, and in the echoes of Pembroke Castle, one can still imagine that long-ago cry of a 13-year-old girl, torn apart by labour, giving birth not only to a child but to a new chapter in England's history.